New Year's Eve had always been a big deal for Linda and me. We'd been married for 10 years, and every year we made a point of celebrating in style. It was our tradition getting dressed up, hitting a fancy party, and counting down to midnight with champagne and fireworks. But this year felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. We were at my boss's annual New Year's bash, a swanky affair at his massive house just outside the city. Everyone who was anyone at the company was there, and Tom Miller, my boss, was in his element, playing the gracious host. Linda was by my side, as always, looking stunning in a little black dress that hugged her curves just right. I caught more than a few guys sneaking glances at her, and it made me proud and, oddly, a bit nervous. I had been with the company for over a decade, working my way up from the bottom. I had seen Tom at his best and worst, and while we weren't exactly friends, there was a mutual respect. He knew I was good at my job, and I knew he was the one who could make or break my career. So when he leaned over and whispered in my ear, "Mark, come to my office in about 20 minutes. We need to talk." I didn't think twice. I nodded, figuring it was something about the business, or maybe even a surprise promotion. Linda and I mingled for a while longer, chatting with my colleagues and their spouses, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Something wasn't right. I excused myself from the conversation, kissed Linda on the cheek, and told her I'd be back soon. She smiled and told me not to keep her waiting too long. I made my way through the crowded hallways, dodging people who were already tipsy from the free-flowing champagne. Tom's office was on the second floor, away from the noise of the party. As I walked up the stairs, I mentally prepared myself for the conversation. I had no idea what he wanted to talk about, but I was determined to make a good impression. When I reached the door, I hesitated for just a second before knocking. There was no answer, so I turned the handle and stepped inside. What I saw next knocked the wind out of me. Linda was kneeling on the floor in front of Tom, her lips wrapped around him as he sat back in his chair with a smug smile plastered across his face. My wife, the woman I had loved and trusted for so long, was right there, betraying me in the most humiliating way possible. Tom looked up, met my eyes, and grinned like the devil himself. "I definitely like your New Year gift, Mark." For a moment, everything went black. The world spun, and all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the image in front of me was undeniable. My wife was cheating on me with my boss, and they weren't even trying to hide it. I don't remember how long I stood there, frozen in place, but when I finally snapped out of it, rage consumed me. Tom's smug grin, Linda's betrayal. It all came crashing down on me like a tidal wave. I felt a surge of anger that I had never experienced before. Without thinking, I lunged at Tom, grabbing him by the collar and yanking him out of the chair. Linda screamed, but I didn't care. I wasn't thinking rationally. I wasn't thinking at all. All I wanted was to make him pay, to hurt him the way he had hurt me. I threw Tom across the room, sending him crashing into the desk. Papers and books scattered everywhere, and the lamp shattered as it hit the floor. Linda was crying, begging me to stop, but her voice was just background noise to the fury inside me. Tom tried to scramble to his feet, but I was on him again, landing a punch squarely on his jaw. His head snapped back and he stumbled, but I didn't let up. I hit him again and again, years of frustration, anger, and betrayal pouring out of me in every blow. Finally, someone burst into the room, one of Tom's security guards, probably drawn by the noise. He pulled me off Tom, shouting something I couldn't hear. I struggled against him, still trying to get at Tom, who was now slumped against the wall, blood trickling from his mouth. The guard was stronger than I was, and eventually he managed to drag me out of the office. As I was pulled away, I caught one last glimpse of Linda, her face a mix of horror and regret. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but one thing was clear: my life had just shattered into a million pieces, and there was no way to put it back together. To be continued. I left that party in a daze. My mind was reeling and every step felt heavy, like I was trudging through quicksand. The anger that had fueled my attack on Tom had drained away, leaving only a hollow numbness in its place. I didn't even know where I was going, just that I needed to get out of there, away from Linda, away from Tom, away from everything. The streets were cold and deserted. New Year's Eve parties were still in full swing inside the warm houses I passed, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing, harsh and uneven. My heart was still pounding, but not from exertion. This was something deeper, more primal. Betrayal, humiliation, fury. It was all still there, simmering under the surface, waiting to explode again. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't face it, not after what I had seen. Instead, I found myself in a dingy hotel on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one asked questions, and I was grateful for that. I paid for the room in cash, not even bothering to count the change, and headed upstairs. The room was as depressing as I felt: stale air, peeling wallpaper, a bed that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. I didn't care. I collapsed onto the mattress, staring up at the cracked ceiling, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. How had it come to this? Just hours ago, I was at a party, laughing and drinking, celebrating another year with the woman I loved. And now I was alone in a cheap hotel room, my marriage in ruins, my trust shattered. It was like some twisted joke, but there was nothing funny about it. I don't know how long I lay there, replaying the scene over and over in my mind: Linda on her knees, Tom's smug smile, the sound of my fists connecting with his face. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. The next morning, the harsh light of day made everything worse. I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, my head pounding and my body aching from the previous night's confrontation. For a moment, I hoped it had all been a bad dream. But reality came crashing down as soon as I opened my eyes. I needed to get out of that room, away from the memories that clung to every corner. I threw on my clothes and left without a backward glance. My car was still parked outside Tom's house, but there was no way I was going back there. Instead, I called a cab and gave the driver my home address, my stomach churning at the thought of going back to the house I shared with Linda. The ride home was agonizingly slow. Every mile felt like another reminder of what I was about to face. How was I going to deal with this? How was I going to confront Linda? Would she even be there, or had she run off with Tom after the party? The questions buzzed around my head like angry bees, but I had no answers. When I finally got home, the house was eerily quiet. No sign of Linda. For a brief, foolish moment, I hoped she might be waiting for me, ready to apologize, to beg for forgiveness. But as I stepped inside, the silence confirmed my worst fears. She wasn't there, and the house felt emptier than ever. I walked through the rooms, each one a painful reminder of the life we had built together. The photos on the wall, the furniture we had picked out, the little knickknacks that made the place feel like home. All of it tainted now, poisoned by what I had seen. I couldn't even bring myself to go into our bedroom. The thought of sleeping in the same bed where we had shared so many intimate moments made me sick. Instead, I sat on the couch, staring at nothing, trying to figure out what to do next. I knew I had to talk to Linda, to confront her about what had happened, but the thought of seeing her again made my skin crawl. How could I look at her and not see her with Tom? How could I ever trust her again? The day passed in a blur, the hours slipping by unnoticed. I didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't even move from the couch. My mind was a battlefield, torn between anger and sadness, love and hate. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, and the rage flared up again, hot and violent. By the time night fell, I was a mess. I hadn't showered, hadn't shaved, hadn't done anything but stew in my own misery. I was too wired to sleep, too exhausted to stay awake. And then, just as I was about to finally collapse from sheer exhaustion, the door opened. Linda walked in, looking as broken as I felt. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, her eyes red from crying. She saw me on the couch and froze, the color draining from her face. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, the air thick with tension. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am so sorry. I didn't say anything. I couldn't." The sight of her standing there looking so fragile almost broke me. But then the memories came flooding back the office. Tom's grin, the betrayal, and any pity I might have felt vanished. "Sorry?" I finally said, my voice cold and flat. You're sorry? Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. Mark, please, just let me explain. Explain what? I snapped. Explain how you ended up fucking my boss at a New Year's Eve party? Or maybe explain how you've been lying to me for God knows how long. She flinched at the harshness of my words, but I was beyond caring. I was done with being the nice guy, the understanding husband. I wanted answers, and I wanted them now. Mark, it wasn't he like that, she pleaded, stepping closer. It was a mistake. I never meant for any of this to happen. A mistake? I echoed bitterly. You call that a mistake? What the hell, Linda? What the fuck were you thinking? She broke down then, sobbing uncontrollably. I don't know, I wasn't thinking. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, towering over her, my anger boiling over. You weren't thinking? That's your excuse? You just decided to throw away our marriage on a whim? Mark, please, she sobbed. I love you. I never wanted to hurt you. It just happened. Stop, I shouted, cutting her off. Just stop. I can't listen to this bullshit anymore. She collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands, her body shaking with sobs. I wanted to comfort her, to hold her and tell her everything would be okay, but I couldn't. Not after what I had seen, not after what she had done. Instead, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her there to cry alone. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there, not with her, not with the weight of her betrayal suffocating me. I grabbed my car keys and left the house without another word, my mind racing with thoughts of revenge, of escape, of anything that could take away the pain. But deep down, I knew there was no escaping this. My life, as I knew it, was over, and there was no going back. I drove aimlessly through the night, the city lights blurring as I tried to outrun the storm raging inside me. Every turn I took, every street I passed felt meaningless. I just needed to get away, to put distance between myself and the memories of that night. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape the image of Linda on her knees, Tom's smirk, the way she had looked at me when she walked through the door. The anger was still there, burning like acid in my gut, but now it was mixed with something darker despair. The kind of despair that eats away at you, gnawing at your insides until there's nothing left. I didn't know what to do, how to process what I'd seen, what I'd done. It felt like my entire life had been ripped out from under me, and I was free, falling into an abyss with no end in sight. I don't know how long I drove before I ended up at the river, the same spot where Linda and I used to go when we first started dating, back when everything was new and exciting. It was a place full of good memories, of laughter, late-night talks, and stolen kisses. Now it just felt like a cruel reminder of everything I'd lost. I parked the car and got out, walking down to the water's edge. The river was calm, the surface reflecting the moonlight in a way that would have been peaceful if my mind wasn't in such turmoil. I stood there for a while, staring out at the water, trying to find some kind of clarity, but all I could think about was how I had let things get this far. How had I missed the signs? Had I been that blind? Or had Linda been that good at hiding it? I racked my brain, searching for any clue, any moment that might have hinted at what was happening, but I came up empty. Maybe I had been too focused on work, too wrapped up in my own world to see what was right in front of me. Or maybe I just didn't want to see it, didn't want to admit that the woman I loved was capable of such betrayal. I don't know how long I stood there, lost in my thoughts, but eventually, the cold started to seep into my bones, snapping me back to reality. I couldn't stay out here all night, and I sure as hell couldn't go back home, not yet. But there was one place I could go, one person who might be able to help me make sense of this mess. My best friend Greg lived on the other side of town. We had been through everything together: college, breakups, job changes, you name it. He was the one person I could always count on, and right now I needed him more than ever. I got back in the car and headed to Greg's place, my mind still reeling, but a small part of me clinging to the hope that he could help me figure out what to do next. When I pulled up in front of his apartment, it was nearly 2 a.m., but I didn't care. I needed to talk to someone, to unload this crushing weight before it consumed me entirely. I knocked on the door, and after what felt like an eternity, Greg answered, looking groggy and confused. He was still in his pajamas, his hair sticking up at odd angles, But when he saw the look on my face, his expression shifted to concern. "Mark, what the hell happened?" he asked, stepping aside to let me in. I didn't even know where to start. How do you tell your best friend that your wife, the woman you thought you knew better than anyone, had just destroyed your life in the most humiliating way possible? I just stood there staring at the floor, my hands trembling. "Mark, you were scaring me, man," Greg said, gently guiding me to the couch. "Sit down, tell me what's going on." I sat down, the weight of everything finally crashing down on me. The anger, the shock, the pain, it all came out in a flood of words that I could barely control. "Linda," I choked out, my voice breaking. She's been cheating on me, Greg. I caught her with Tom last night, at the fucking New Year's party." Greg's eyes widened in shock, his face going pale. "Jesus Christ, Mark, are you serious?" I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with emotion. "Oh man," Greg muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I'm so sorry, I don't even know what to say." We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of my confession hanging heavy in the air. Greg didn't push me to talk, didn't try to offer any hollow words of comfort. He just sat with me, his presence a small but much-needed anchor in the storm that was tearing me apart. Eventually, he broke the silence. "So, what are you going to do?" That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? What the hell was I going to do? I had no idea. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, to just walk away from the whole mess and start over somewhere new. But I knew it wasn't that simple. My life was here, my job, my house, everything. I couldn't just walk away from that no matter how much I wanted to. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I really don't know." Greg nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Well, you can stay here for as long as you need to. But Mark, you're going to have to face her eventually. You need to figure out what you want. Do you want to try to work things out? Or are you done?" I hadn't let myself think that far ahead yet. The idea of trying to fix things, of forgiving Linda for what she'd done, seemed impossible. But so did the thought of ending our marriage, of throwing away everything we had built together. "I don't know if I can forgive her, Greg," I said, my voice breaking again. "I don't know if I want to." Greg sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I get it, man. What she did. That is unforgivable. But you need to decide what's best for you. Don't to do anything rash. Take some time, think about it, and then go from there." We talked for a while longer, mostly about nothing in particular, just to keep my mind from spiraling. Eventually, the exhaustion caught up with me, and Greg set me up on the couch with a blanket and a pillow. As I lay there in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, my mind still racing, I knew that Greg was right. I needed to figure out what I wanted, what I was going to do. But the thought of facing Linda, of confronting her again, made my stomach churn. Sleep didn't come easy that night, and when it finally did, it was filled with nightmares, visions of Linda and Tom, of betrayal and rage, of a future I couldn't bear to imagine. But one thing was clear: whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. Morning came too soon, and I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. The nightmares had been relentless, a constant reminder of the reality I couldn't escape. My body ached, my head throbbed, and for a moment I considered just lying there, letting the world pass me by. But I knew I couldn't do that. I had to face the mess that was my life. Greg was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He looked up when I walked in, concern etched across his face. "Morning," he said cautiously, as if afraid I might shatter at any moment. "Morning," I replied, my voice rough from sleep and the weight of everything I had been through. I sat down across from him, accepting the cup of coffee he slid my way. The bitter warmth was a small comfort, but it did nothing to ease the turmoil inside me. "Any idea what you're going to do?" Greg asked, breaking the silence. I stared into the black depths of my coffee, my mind racing. "I have to talk to her. I can't avoid it forever." Greg nodded, his expression serious. "You were right. But Mark, you need to be careful. Don T let her manipulate you. She might try to twist things, make you feel guilty, but Don T fall for it. You deserve better." His words made sense, but they didn't make the task ahead any easier. I knew I had to confront Linda, to get answers, to figure out where we stood. But the thought of facing her again, of looking into the eyes of the woman who had betrayed me, made me feel sick. After a long, silent breakfast, I finally gathered the courage to leave. Greg offered to come with me, but I told him I needed to do this alone. He understood, but I could see the worry in his eyes as I walked out the door. The drive back to my house felt like a death march. Each mile brought me closer to a confrontation I wasn't sure I was ready for. When I finally pulled into the driveway, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the front door, trying to summon the strength to go inside. The house looked the same as it always had, quiet, unassuming, a place that had once been filled with love and laughter. But now it felt like a stranger's home, a place I no longer belonged. Finally, I forced myself to get out of the car. The walk to the front door felt like it took an eternity. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, and I had to take a deep breath to steady myself before turning it and stepping inside. The house was silent, the kind of heavy silence that only exists in the aftermath of a disaster. I walked through the rooms looking for Linda, half hoping she wouldn't be there. But I found her in the living room, sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, which was playing some old movie neither of us cared about. She looked up when I entered the room, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "Mark." She started, but I cut her off. "Don T," I said sharply. "Just Don T." I couldn't bear to hear her apologies, her excuses, not yet. I needed answers first. I needed to understand how we had gotten to this point, why she had done what she did. I couldn't move forward until I knew the truth. "Why?" I asked, my voice trembling with the weight of everything I was feeling. "Why did you do it, Linda? How long has this been going on?" She flinched at the question, her face crumpling as fresh tears welled up in her eyes. "Mark, I didn't mean for it to happen. It wasn't supposed to be like this." "Then how the hell was it supposed to be?" I demanded, my voice rising with anger. "You were supposed to be my wife, Linda. You were supposed to love me, to be faithful to me. How could you do this?" She broke down completely then, sobbing uncontrollably. I don't know why I did it. It just happened. Tom, he was there and I was lonely and I didn't think. I made a mistake, Mark. A terrible, horrible mistake." "Lonely?" I repeated, my mind struggling to process what she was saying. "What do you mean you were lonely? We were together. We've always been together." She wiped at her eyes, trying to compose herself. "It wasn't like that, Mark. I don't know how to explain it, but something changed. I started feeling disconnected, like we were just going through the motions, like something was missing. And then Tom. He was there and he made me feel wanted. I know it's no excuse, but that's how it started." Her words cut deep like a knife twisting in my gut. The thought of Linda feeling that way, of her turning to someone else because I had failed to make her feel loved, was almost too much to bear. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, her eyes filled with guilt. "A few months," she admitted. "It started at work. Little things at first. Flirting, texting, and then it just escalated. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop." My heart shattered into a million pieces at her confession. A few months. For months she had been betraying me, lying to me, and I hadn't seen it. I had been blind, complacent, trusting, while she was sneaking around behind my back. "And last night?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Was that the first time?" She shook her head, the tears flowing freely now. "No, it wasn't the first time, but it was the last, I swear. I know I have ruined everything, but Mark, I love you. I never stopped loving you. I lost my way." Her words, her tears, her desperation, they were all too much. I felt like I was drowning, like the walls were closing in on me, suffocating me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was feel the pain, the betrayal, the overwhelming sense of loss. "I need to get out of here," I said abruptly, turning on my heel and heading for the door. "Mark, please!" Linda called after me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stay there, not with her, not with everything she had just told me. I needed space, distance, time to process what I had heard. I walked out of the house, slamming the door behind me, and got into my car. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere was better than there. I drove aimlessly for a while, the streets a blur, as I tried to escape the thoughts that were clawing at my mind. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't outrun the truth. Linda had cheated on me. She had betrayed our marriage, our love, and there was no taking that back. No matter what she said, no matter how sorry she was, things would never be the same. I ended up back at Greg S. place, too numb to even explain what had happened. He took one look at me and knew things hadn't gone well. He didn't ask any questions, just handed me a beer and sat with me in silence. As the night wore on, I started to realize that this was only the beginning. The road ahead was going to be long and painful, filled with difficult choices and even more difficult conversations. I didn't know if I could forgive Linda, if I even wanted to try. But one thing was clear: my life, my marriage, was hanging by a thread, and it was up to me to decide what to do next. The next few days passed in a haze of confusion and anger. I stayed at Greg S. place, avoiding my own home like it was cursed. I couldn't bring myself to go back, not with the memories of that night still so fresh in my mind. I couldn't stand the thought of seeing Linda, of facing her lies and her betrayal again. Greg tried his best to help, but there was only so much he could do. He gave me space when I needed it, and a listening ear when I felt like talking, but he couldn't fix the broken pieces of my life. No one could. On the third day, I decided it was time to go back to the house. I couldn't hide out forever. I needed clothes, a plan, something to hold on to. So, after downing 2 cups of coffee and mentally preparing myself, I got in my car and drove back to the place that no longer felt like home. When I pulled into the driveway, Linda S. car was there, parked in its usual spot. Just seeing it made my stomach turn. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves before I walked inside. I didn't know what I was expecting, but the sight of Linda sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of coffee, still took me by surprise. She looked up as I entered, her eyes tired and red-rimmed. "Mark," she started, her voice barely a whisper. I held up a hand, cutting her off. "I'm not here to talk, I'm just getting some things." She nodded, her expression defeated. "I understand." The tension in the room was suffocating as I walked past her and headed upstairs to our bedroom, or what used to be our bedroom. The bed, the dresser, the closet, it all felt foreign now, tainted by what had happened. I grabbed a suitcase from the closet and started throwing clothes into it, not caring about what I packed. I just needed to get out of there, to put some distance between myself and the wreckage of our marriage. As I stuffed the last of my clothes into the suitcase, I heard Linda S. footsteps behind me. I turned to find her standing in the doorway, her eyes pleading. "Mark, please, we need to talk. You can just leave like this." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "What is there to talk about, Linda? You made your choice. You slept with him. You lied to me. What more is there to say?" She flinched at my words, her face crumpling with guilt. "I know I messed up, okay? I know I hurt you. But Mark, I love you. I have always loved you. I don't want to lose you. You should have thought about that before you fucked my boss," I snapped, the anger bubbling up again. "You destroyed everything, Linda. How do you expect me to just forget that?" She took a step closer, her voice trembling. "I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to give me a chance to make it right. Please, Mark, I am begging you. We can go to counseling. We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes." I stared at her, trying to find some trace of the woman I had married, the woman I had loved. But all I saw was a stranger, someone who had lied to me, betrayed me, shattered my trust. How could we ever get back to what we had before? How could I ever look at her without seeing Tom, without feeling that deep, gnawing pain? "I don't know if I can do this," I said finally, my voice hollow. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Please, Mark, just give me a chance. That is all I'm asking." I wanted to say yes, to tell her that we could work through this, that our love was strong enough to survive anything. But the words wouldn't come. The wound was too fresh, too deep. I couldn't promise her something I wasn't sure I could deliver. Instead, I turned away, closing the suitcase and zipping it up. "I need time," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I need to figure out what I want. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I'll wait for you, Mark. I'll do whatever it takes. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I picked up the suitcase and walked past her, the weight of everything dragging me down. As I reached the front door, I paused, glancing back at her one last time. She was still standing in the doorway, watching me leave, her face a mask of sorrow and regret. I'm sorry, I said quietly, before stepping outside and closing the door behind me. The drive back to Greg S. was a blur, my mind a tangled mess of emotions. I wanted to scream, to cry, to hit something, anything to release the pressure building inside me. But all I could do was grip the steering wheel and focus on the road ahead, trying to keep the tears at bay. When I got back to Greg S.'s place, he was waiting for me in the living room, a beer in hand. He took one look at me and handed me another bottle, not saying a word. I collapsed onto the couch, the exhaustion finally catching up with me. What now? Greg asked, breaking the silence. I took a long sip of the beer, trying to drown out the chaos in my head. I don't know, I admitted. I really don't know. Greg nodded, his expression sympathetic. You know you are welcome to stay here as long as you need to. No pressure. Thanks, man, I said, grateful for his support. For a while, we just sat there drinking in silence. The TV was on, playing some mindless show, but I wasn't paying attention. My thoughts kept drifting back to Linda, to the mess that was our marriage, to the uncertainty of what lay ahead. At some point, Greg got up and left the room, returning with a duffel bag. He tossed it onto the couch next to me. What's this? I asked, confused. He gave me a knowing look. You need a break, Mark. You need to clear your head. Get away from all this shit for a while. I frowned, unzipping the bag to find a change of clothes, a toothbrush, and a few other essentials. Where am I supposed to go? Greg grinned. I booked you a cabin in the mountains. A buddy of mine owns it, and he's letting you use it for as long as you need. It's isolated, quiet, perfect for getting your thoughts together. I stared at him, surprised by the gesture. You didn't have to do this. Yeah, I did, he said, his tone serious. You are my best friend, and you're going through hell right now. The least I can do is give you a place to escape to. I felt a lump form in my throat, the weight of everything threatening to overwhelm me. Thanks, Greg. I don't know what I'd do without you. He clapped me on the shoulder, his grip reassuring. Don't mention it. Now go. Get out of here. Take as much time as you need. I didn't need any more convincing. The idea of escaping to the mountains, of leaving all the pain and confusion behind, was exactly what I needed. I grabbed the duffel bag and headed for the door, feeling a strange mix of relief and anxiety. As I drove away from Greg S.'s place, the city slowly giving way to the open road, I felt a sense of freedom that I hadn't felt in days. Maybe this was what I needed, a chance to breathe, to think, to figure out what the hell I was going to do with my life. But even as I left the city behind, the memories of Linda, of our shattered marriage, followed me like a shadow. I knew I couldn't run from them forever. Sooner or later, I'd have to face the truth, to make a decision about my future. But for now, I just needed to get away, to find some peace in the solitude of the mountains, to be alone with my thoughts, my regrets, my broken heart. The drive to the cabin was long, winding through endless stretches of forested roads and mountainous terrain. The deeper I went, the more the world seemed to fade away, leaving nothing but the sound of my tires on the pavement and the occasional rustling of leaves as a breeze swept through the trees. It was exactly what I needed, distance from everything, from Linda, from the life that had crumbled beneath me. The cabin was nestled deep in the mountains, far from the noise and chaos of the city. It was a small, rustic place, but it had everything I needed: a bed, a kitchen, a fireplace, and most importantly, silence. The kind of silence that wraps around you, thick and heavy, offering no distractions, no escape from your own thoughts. As soon as I arrived, I unloaded my duffel bag and stepped inside. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine and earth. I could hear the distant sound of a river rushing through the valley below, its constant soothing rhythm the only company I had. I dropped my bag by the door and walked through the cabin, taking in the simple, unadorned space. There were no pictures on the walls, no reminders of a life lived here, just the bare essentials. It was perfect, no reminders of what I was running from. After I settled in, I built a fire in the stone fireplace. The warmth slowly filled the room, chasing away the chill that had settled in my bones since that night. I sat in front of the fire, staring into the flames as they danced and flickered, my thoughts swirling in time with the embers. I didn't know how long I sat there, lost in the hypnotic crackling of the fire. The hours slipped away, and the light outside faded into darkness. But I didn't move. I didn't eat, didn't drink, just sat there, my mind trapped in an endless loop of memories, doubts, and questions that had no answers. Eventually, the fire died down, leaving only glowing coals and the faint scent of smoke in the air. I felt empty, drained, like there was nothing left inside me but the remnants of a life that had been shattered. The darkness outside pressed in on the cabin, the quiet so complete that it was almost oppressive. I tried to distract myself, picking up a book I found on the coffee table, but the words blurred together on the page, meaningless. My thoughts kept drifting back to Linda, to that night, to everything that had been said and done. The pain was still raw, still gnawing at me, a constant reminder that no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the reality of my situation. As the night wore on, the cabin grew colder, the fire's warmth fading away. I wrapped a blanket around myself, but it did little to chase away the chill that had settled in my bones. Sleep seemed impossible, but I knew I needed rest, needed to shut off my mind, if only for a few hours. I eventually gave in, lying down on the couch and pulling the blanket over me. The silence of the cabin was almost too much, amplifying the thoughts that wouldn't leave me alone. I tossed and turned, trying to find a comfortable position, but the ache in my chest refused to let me rest. When sleep finally came, it was fitful and full of nightmares. I saw Linda and Tom together, the scene replaying over and over in my mind, each time more vivid, more painful. I saw the look in her eyes when she admitted to the affair, the guilt, the regret, but also something else, something that felt like betrayal all over again. The nightmares twisted and morphed, turning into a chaotic mess of memories, fears, and anxieties that I couldn't control. I dreamed of losing everything, of being alone, of watching my life fall apart with no way to stop it. It was a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, and when I finally did, I was drenched in sweat, my heart racing, my hands shaking. The cabin was still dark, the fire long dead. The clock on the wall told me it was just after 3 a.m., but it might as well have been the middle of the night. The darkness felt endless, suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was drowning in it. I got up, pacing the small space of the cabin, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I felt like a caged animal, trapped in a mind that wouldn't give me any peace. The isolation that had seemed so appealing just hours ago now felt like a prison, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, hoping the cool night air would clear my head. The sky was a deep, inky black, the stars shining brightly above, but it did little to ease the tension coiled inside me. The air was cold, biting, but I welcomed the sting, anything to distract me from the turmoil in my mind. I walked down the path that led to the river, the sound of rushing water growing louder as I approached. The river was a dark ribbon, cutting through the landscape, its surface reflecting the faint light of the stars. I stood at the edge, staring into the water, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. The pain was still there, a constant ache in my chest that refused to go away. The betrayal, the lies, it all felt like too much, like I was drowning in a sea of emotions that I couldn't control. I wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all, but I didn't have the energy. I was too exhausted, too beaten down. For the first time since I left home, I allowed myself to cry. The tears came slowly at first, then faster, until I was sobbing uncontrollably, my body shaking with the force of it. I felt like I was breaking apart, piece by piece, with no way to stop it. The pain, the anger, the sadness, it all poured out of me, leaving me feeling hollow and empty. I didn't know how long I stood there crying by the river, but when the tears finally stopped, I felt a strange sense of calm. The pain was still there, but it was more manageable, more distant, like a wound that had finally stopped bleeding. The night was still cold, still dark, but the river's steady rhythm was soothing, grounding me in a way that nothing else had. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs, and made my way back to the cabin. The darkness didn't seem as oppressive now, the silence more peaceful than suffocating. I crawled back onto the couch, pulling the blanket around me, and closed my eyes. Sleep came easier this time, and when I woke, the first light of dawn was creeping through the windows. The world outside was quiet and still, the air crisp and clean. I felt a little better, a little stronger, like maybe I could face the day ahead. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if I could ever forgive Linda, or if our marriage could be saved. But for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there, and it was enough to keep me going. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the mountains, I knew I had a long road ahead of me. But I was ready to start walking it, one step at a time. The following morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping outside the cabin, their cheerful songs a stark contrast to the darkness that had weighed me down the night before. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the landscape. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of calm, a small break in the storm that had been raging inside me. I brewed a pot of coffee and stepped outside onto the porch, cradling the warm mug in my hands. The air was cold and crisp, but the fresh scent of pine and earth was invigorating. I took a deep breath, letting the coolness fill my lungs, and for a moment, I just stood there, watching the world wake up around me. The mountains stretched out in every direction, majestic and serene, as if they were indifferent to the chaos in my life. It was humbling, standing there surrounded by such beauty, knowing that the world kept turning no matter how broken I felt. It made me realize that life went on, with or without me, and that I had a choice to make. Either I let the pain consume me, or I found a way to move forward. I wasn't ready to make any big decisions. Not yet. But I knew I couldn't stay in limbo forever. Sooner or later, I'd have to face Linda again, and I'd have to figure out what came next. But for now, I focused on finding some clarity, some peace, even if it was just for a few fleeting moments. I spent the day hiking through the mountains, following trails that wound through the trees and led to breathtaking overlooks. The physical exertion was exactly what I needed, pushing my body to keep moving, to focus on something other than the turmoil in my mind. Each step felt like a small victory, a reminder that I was still capable, still strong, even if I didn't feel that way. As I climbed higher, the air grew colder, the trees thinning out until they were replaced by rocky outcroppings and snow-dusted peaks. The view from the top was nothing short of spectacular. The valley stretched out below, a patchwork of green and brown, with the river snaking through it like a silver thread. The sky was a brilliant blue, the kind that made you feel like you could see forever. I stood there for a long time, taking it all in, letting the cold wind whip through my hair and clear my mind. Up here, with the world spread out before me, the problems that had seemed so insurmountable back in the city felt smaller, more manageable. The mountains had a way of putting things in perspective, of reminding you that there was so much more to life than the pain you carried. On the way back down, I felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The hike had cleared my head, given me a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in days. I knew I still had a lot to figure out, but for the first time I felt like I could actually do it. Back at the cabin, I built a fire and made a simple dinner. The warmth from the flames and the smell of food cooking filled the space with a sense of coziness that was comforting in its simplicity. As I ate, I allowed myself to think about Linda, about what our marriage had been and what it had become. I remembered the good times, the love we had shared, the life we had built together. But I couldn't ignore the betrayal, the lies, the way she had torn my heart out with her actions. It was hard to reconcile those two versions of our relationship, the one that had been full of love and trust, and the one that had ended in deceit. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I wasn't just grieving the loss of my marriage. I was grieving the loss of the person I had thought Linda was. The woman who had shared my bed, my life, my dreams. She wasn't the same person who had cheated on me with my boss. It was like discovering that the foundation of your house was rotten after you had already moved in. You couldn't just ignore it. You had to decide whether to rebuild or tear it all down. As I sat there in the quiet of the cabin, the fire crackling softly beside me, I started to accept that the marriage I had known was over. Whether Linda and I could rebuild something from the ashes was still unclear, but the life we had shared before was gone, and it wasn't coming back. That realization was painful, but it was also freeing. It gave me the space to think about what I wanted, what I needed, instead of just focusing on what I had lost. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future without Linda, a future where I could start over, build something new. The next few days followed a similar pattern, hiking through the mountains, spending hours in the quiet solitude of the wilderness, and then returning to the cabin to reflect. The mountains became my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the noise in my head and find some semblance of peace. I didn't have all the answers, but I was starting to see the path forward, one step at a time. By the end of the week, I felt stronger, more grounded, like I had finally started to reclaim a part of myself that I had lost. The pain of Linda's betrayal was still there, but it wasn't as sharp, not as all-consuming. I knew that healing would take time, but at least now I believed it was possible. On the last night in the cabin, I sat out on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars twinkle above. The air was cold, but it was a refreshing kind of cold, the kind that made you feel alive. As I sat there, I thought about the decisions I needed to make, the conversations I needed to have with Linda, the choices that would shape my future. I still didn't know if I could forgive her, or if I even wanted to try, but I knew I had to talk to her, to face the reality of our situation and decide where we went from here. Whether we tried to rebuild our marriage or parted ways, I couldn't keep running from it. As the stars blinked down at me from the vastness of the sky, I felt a sense of resolve settle over me. I didn't know what the future held, but I was ready to face it, whatever it might be. I was ready to go back, to confront Linda, to find out if there was anything left to salvage. And if there wasn't, well, then I would find a way to move on, to rebuild my life on my own terms, one step at a time.